Jackanory always managed to attract the biggest names in entertainment, theatre and film. In 1978, the producers secured the services of one of Britain's brightest young actresses. Judi Dench had already acquired a stellar reputation following her outstanding performances for the Royal Shakespeare Company and her role in Franco Zeffirelli's film Romeo and Juliet. Accompanied by the gentle whine of a sleeping puppy, Dame Judi read Phillipa Pearce's A Dog So Small, a story so moving that by the end of the recording, the studio production team were reduced to tears.
Today, I've come to the last part of the story about Ben Blewett, who wanted to have a dog of his very own, and couldn't because he lived in the middle of London. For his birthday one year, his grandparents sent him a picture of a dog, a special kind of dog, a Chihuahua, the smallest breed in the world. And somehow, because Ben was so unhappy, he pretended the dog in the picture was real. But that still wasn't good enough. Then he heard that his grandfather's old dog Tilly had had 9 puppies, and his grandma said one of the puppies could be Ben's. Well, that was almost worse. Now Ben owned a dog, a real flesh and blood dog, but still he couldn't keep it in London. One day, Ben's family went to look at a new flat in North London. Mrs. Blewett wanted to live nearer her daughter, who'd just got married. And while everyone was busy, Ben went for a walk. He walked along 1 or 2 streets and round a corner, and there, stretching in front of him, he saw the biggest park in London, the wild, hilly expanses of Hampstead Heath. And he realized that if his mother really did decide to move, at last, he'd be able to have his dog. He started walking, hardly able to believe his eyes. None of the paths were properly made with asphalt or gravel. They were just dusty tracks that wound across the heath without any plan. After a bit he ran across the grass. There were no notices saying he couldn't. Wherever he went he saw dogs that ran without a lead and barked to their heart's content. Ben seemed to walk for hours, and still the heath went on. Suddenly, from the feel of his stomach, he thought he was probably very late for tea. He turned to go back and then realized in a panic that he didn't know where he was. Then he saw a man who seemed like a park keeper. "Please, could you tell me the way to get back?" Ben asked him, and described the green space where he'd left his 2 brothers playing football. "That would be Parliament Hill," said the keeper, and explained how to get back. Ben thanked him and then said, "Please, now what is it now? Please, said Ben, "can anyone take a dog on the heath and just let him run free? Are there no rules?" The park keeper looked horrified. "No rules? No bylaws? Course there are. We can't have dogs getting out of control on the heath." As the keeper spoke, 2 dogs tore up the path on which he was standing. But the keeper took no notice. Ben was puzzled. "How exactly must they not get out of control?" he asked. "Well, biting people, mainly." Well, that was reasonable enough rule. Ben began to feel quite cheerful. The 2 dogs they'd seen before came past again. "And no lead," said Ben. "No, just so long as they're under proper control. Now off you go home the way I told you." Ben ran, as light as air. He was so happy. He was late for tea, of course. When he got to May's flat, everyone had finished. They'd saved him some toast and cakes, but were too busy talking about the flat to be cross. But now it seemed that Mrs. Blewett couldn't make up her mind. May kept telling her how cheap it was, and Charlie, May's husband, said if the Blewetts didn't take it, someone else would. But Mrs. Blewett said the place seemed very poky. Ben just had to say something. "I like it," he said. "I like the house. I like where it is. I'd like to live here." Everyone laughed, and Ben was glad he hadn't said why he wanted to live there. They might have laughed at that too, but nothing was decided that day. There was only one other thing Ben must do. He must stop Grandpa finding another home for his dog. He hoped it wasn't already too late. That evening, he sat down and wrote a postcard to his grandfather, which said, "Keep my puppy for me. We'll write more later." He posted it on Monday morning. He wouldn't let himself even think that by the time the card arrived, Grandpa might have found the puppy another home. On Tuesday, a letter came from Grandpa with a long message for Ben. 3 more of the puppies had gone. Now there was only 1 left. "Chiquitito," whispered Ben. It had been a near thing. His card must have crossed Grandpa's letter in the post. Grandpa would be warned by now. That morning, old Mr. Fitch read Ben's postcard aloud to his wife. Neither of them questioned keeping the puppy. It was Ben's. "As long as he takes it away someday," said Granny. "That's all." "Well," said Grandpa, "it sounds to me as if he's hoping to keep a dog in London after all." The idea gripped him. He was full of happiness for Ben. "All I hope is that he's not due for any disappointment," said Mrs. Fitch. Ben's parents could still not make up their minds to take the flat they'd seen that Sunday. It was not exactly what Mrs. Blewett had hoped for, she said. On the other hand, she had to admit that other flats were usually more expensive or less convenient, or farther away from May and Dillis. Slowly she was coming round to it. But would it be in time? So Ben held his breath. He would not allow himself to show emotion. He tried not to count on having a dog. He tried not to think about a dog. But he could not think about anything else properly at all. The dog that he had chased from his thoughts in the daytime crept back into his dreams at night. Tilly's tiny brown puppy, who was also the minute, intrepid, and altogether extraordinary Chihuahua, named Chiquitito. Ben called him by that name, as in his dreams they roamed Hampstead Heath together. At last, Mrs. Blewett made up her mind, and the flat had not been snapped up by anyone else, so the Blewetts were able to have it. But even then, Ben hardly dared breathe freely. So much could still go wrong. One day, when Mrs. Blewett was in the middle of packing things into tea chests, Ben said, "Oh, by the way, I could have a dog when I'm living in the new flat, couldn't I?" Mrs. Blewett nearly dropped the clock she was wrapping up. "Really I could," Ben went on, and before she could say anything at all, he told her how close their new home was to the heath, that he could exercise the dog properly, that he himself would see to its feeding and washing, and see it didn't leave mud or hairs around the house. When he'd finished, there was silence. Then Ben's mother said kindly, "If it's possible to have a dog, Ben, of course we'll have it. We always had one when we were children." Ben's two young brothers, Frankie and Paul, began to get interested in the puppy and wanted to know what he looked like. "Well," said Ben, "he's small and sort of lightish brown and very bold and brave." "What are you going to call him?" Mr. Blewett wanted to know, and immediately everyone started suggesting names. Rover, Jack, Laddie. "But he's got his own name already," said Ben. "Grandpa calls him Brown, but his real name's Chiquitito." "What?" said everyone at once. "Chiquitito." "Oh, you can't call him that, Ben," said Mr. Blewett. "His name's Brown." "Chiquitito," said Ben. Then they all told him what an absurd, unthinkable name it was for a dog, but Ben